The dust swirled through the streets of Clearwater like whispered secrets, carrying with it the scent of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and broken dreams. Sarah May clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood beside her father in the town square, her bare feet planted firmly on the wooden platform that served as both auction block and gallows, depending on the day's needs. At 17, she had learned to read the signs of her father's drinking the way other girls learned to read the Bible. The tremor in his hands, the way his eyes couldn't quite focus on any one thing, the desperation that clung to him like the stench of cheap whiskey. "What am I bid for this fine young woman?" Thomas Brennan slurred, his calloused hand gripping Sarah's wrist with fingers that shook from too many nights drowning his sorrows. "She can cook, clean, mend clothes, and she's got her mother's pretty face before the pox took her." His voice cracked on the last words, and Sarah felt something die a little more inside her chest. This wasn't the first time he'd threatened to sell her, but the look in his eyes today told her it might be the last time she'd have to endure the threat without it becoming reality. The crowd that had gathered was the usual collection of drifters, ranch hands, and opportunists that frequented Clearwater's weekly market. Most looked at her with a mixture of pity and calculation, weighing her worth against the coins in their pockets. Sarah kept her chin raised, refusing to let them see the terror that was eating her alive from the inside. She'd rather die than show weakness to these vultures. $30, called out Jake Morrison, a rancher known for working his hands to death and burying them in unmarked graves behind his property. Sarah's stomach lurched, but she forced herself to remain still. 40, came another voice, this one belonging to Samuel Creek, whose last 3 wives had all died under mysterious circumstances. The crowd murmured, some with excitement at the spectacle, others with disgust at what they were witnessing. Sarah's father swayed on his feet, his grip on her wrist tightening. "Do I hear 50? She's young, strong, and ain't been touched by no man." The words felt like physical blows, each one stripping away another piece of her dignity. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but she knew that any resistance would only make things worse for both of them. That's when she heard it, a voice that cut through the chaos like a knife through silk. $200. The crowd fell silent, turning to look at the source of the bid. Sarah followed their gazes and saw him for the first time. A tall man in a dark coat and wide, brimmed hat, his face partially shadowed but his bearing unmistakably confident. He stood apart from the others, one hand resting casually on the butt of a well-worn Colt. 45, the other holding a leather satchel that clinked softly with the sound of real money. 200. Thomas Brennan's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes wide with disbelief. That was more money than he'd seen in 5 years, more than enough to drink himself to death in comfort. "Cash," the stranger said simply, stepping forward through the crowd that parted before him like water. Sarah could see him more clearly now, the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much but hadn't let it break him, eyes the color of winter sky that seemed to look right through her father and find him wanting. "Sold," Thomas shouted before anyone else could bid, his hand already reaching for the stranger's money. The transaction happened quickly, coin and paper changing hands while Sarah stood frozen, unable to process what was happening to her life. The stranger approached her slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "My name is Marcus Whitfield," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "And I give you my word that no harm will come to you under my protection." Sarah searched his face for signs of deception, for the predatory gleam she'd seen in the eyes of other men, but found only a kind of wary sadness that matched her own. "Why?" was all she managed to whisper. "Because everyone deserves a chance at something better," he replied, then turned to address her father. "Thomas Brennan, you will leave this town tonight and never return. If I see your face in Clearwater again, or if I hear you've tried to contact your daughter, I'll hunt you down and finish what the bottle started." Thomas nodded frantically, clutching the money to his chest like a lifeline. He looked at Sarah for a moment, and she thought she saw a flicker of the man he used to be before the grief and guilt consumed him. But then he turned and stumbled away through the crowd without another word. The ride to Marcus Whitfield's ranch took 3 hours, during which Sarah learned that silence could be both comfortable and terrifying. He rode slightly ahead of her on a black stallion that moved like liquid shadow, while she perched uncertainly on a gentle mare he'd provided. The landscape around them gradually changed from the dusty streets of Clearwater to rolling hills covered in scrub grass and dotted with cattle. As they rode, Sarah found herself studying her unlikely savior. Marcus Whitfield carried himself like a man who'd been places and done things, his hands steady on the reins despite the rifle's scabbard and the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. There was something almost military in his bearing, and she wondered what had brought him to this remote corner of Arizona territory. The ranch house, when it finally came into view, was larger than she'd expected but not ostentatious. Built of local stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, it looked like the kind of place where a person could make a life if they were willing to work for it. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see corrals and outbuildings spread across the property like a small town unto itself. "Mrs. Coleman," Marcus called out as they approached the house, and an older woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair pulled back severely, but kind eyes that took in Sarah's appearance with understanding rather than judgment. "Marcus Whitfield, what have you done now?" the woman asked, but there was affection in her voice rather than accusation. "I've brought someone who needs a safe place to stay," he replied, dismounting and helping Sarah down from her horse. "Sarah, this is Mrs. Coleman. She runs this house better than I ever could and makes the best biscuits in 3 counties. Mrs. Coleman approached Sarah with the careful movements of someone who understood skittish animals and traumatized people. "Child, you look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed. Come inside and we'll get you sorted out." That first night at the Whitfield ranch passed in a blur of kindness that Sarah wasn't sure how to accept. Mrs. Coleman drew her a hot bath, the first she'd had in months, and provided clean clothes that actually fit. The dinner table was set with real china and silverware, and the food was more abundant than anything she'd seen since her mother died 3 years ago. Marcus sat across from her during the meal, making gentle conversation about the ranch and the territory, while carefully avoiding any mention of what had brought her there. She learned that he'd been in Arizona for 5 years, that he raised cattle and horses, and that he employed a dozen men who lived in the bunkhouse behind the main corral. "What happens to me now?" Sarah finally asked as Mrs. Coleman cleared the dishes away. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "That depends on what you want to happen. You're not a prisoner here, Sarah. You're not a servant or a debt to be worked off. You're a young woman who deserves the chance to decide her own future." "I don't understand," she said, confusion clear in her voice. "You paid $200 for me. I paid $200 to get you away from a situation that would have destroyed you," he corrected gently. "What I bought was your freedom, not your servitude." The concept was so foreign to her that she couldn't immediately process it. Freedom was something that happened to other people, people who hadn't watched their mothers die of smallpox, people whose fathers didn't drink away everything they owned, people who had choices. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to understand what Marcus had meant. She woke each morning in a real bed with clean sheets, ate meals prepared by Mrs. Coleman, and slowly began to believe that she was safe. Marcus made no demands on her time or attention beyond asking her to help with light household tasks if she was willing. She discovered that Marcus Whitfield was a man of many contradictions. He could gentle a wild horse with infinite patience, but she'd seen him face down 3 armed men in town who'd been harassing a Mexican family, his hand never moving to his gun, but his presence alone enough to send them packing. He read books in the evenings, real books with leather bindings and gold lettering, but he could also track a mountain lion across 20 miles of hard rock. The ranch hands treated her with respectful distance, tipping their hats when they saw her, but never presuming to speak unless spoken to first. She learned that Marcus was a fair but demanding employer, that he paid better wages than most ranchers, and that several of his men had been with him since he'd first arrived in Arizona. It was Mrs. Coleman who finally told her Marcus's story. One evening as they sat on the front porch shelling peas and watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. He was a cavalry officer during the war. The older woman said quietly, her fingers working automatically while her eyes gazed into the distance. Lost his wife and daughter to raiders while he was away fighting. When he came back and found them gone, something broke inside him. He sold everything back east and came out here looking for a place where the past couldn't follow. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared pain that made Marcus's kindness make more sense. How long ago? 7 years now. He's been trying to outrun his ghosts ever since, helping folks when he can, building something good in a place where good things are scarce. Mrs. Coleman's voice was gentle but firm. That's why he bought you from your father, child, not because he wanted something from you, but because he remembered what it felt like to be powerless to save someone you cared about. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 3 months ago, she'd been certain she would die in poverty and degradation, probably before her 20th birthday. Now she was clean and fed and safe, living in a house where people spoke to her with respect and expected nothing from her except common courtesy. But safety, she was learning, came with its own challenges. For the first time in years, she had space to think about what she wanted from life rather than simply focusing on survival. The question terrified her. She began spending more time with Marcus, initially just sitting quietly while he worked with the horses or reviewed ranch accounts, but gradually engaging in conversation. She discovered that he was remarkably well educated, having attended West Point before the war, and that he genuinely seemed to enjoy teaching her things. "You're quick," he told her one afternoon as she successfully managed a particularly difficult arithmetic problem he'd set for her. "With some proper schooling, you could do anything you set your mind to." "What would be the point?" she asked, the question coming out more bitter than she'd intended. "I'm nobody from nowhere. What opportunities are there for someone like me?" Marcus set down his pencil and looked at her seriously. "Sarah, where you came from doesn't define where you can go. I've seen men born to wealth and privilege throw their lives away on gambling and drink. And I've seen people who started with nothing build empires through hard work and determination." Easy words for someone who had advantages to begin with, she said, then immediately regretted the harshness of her tone. Instead of taking offense, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, I did have advantages, and I took them for granted until they were gone. But that doesn't make the principle less true. The question is, what do you want to do with the chance you've been given?" It was a question that haunted her through the summer months as she watched the ranch operate around her. She saw Marcus deal with rustlers and drought, with sick cattle and injured horses, with the dozens of decisions that had to be made every day to keep the operation profitable. She watched Mrs. Coleman manage the household with quiet efficiency, negotiating with suppliers and overseeing the seasonal workers who came through during roundup. Gradually, Sarah began to understand that the ranch was more than just a business, it was a community. The men who worked there weren't just employees but something approaching family, bound together by shared hardship and mutual respect. Marcus knew all their names, their histories, their families back home or lack thereof. When one of them was injured in a fall, Marcus personally rode to town to fetch the doctor and paid the medical bills without question. "Why do you do it?" Sarah asked him one evening as they sat on the porch after a particularly long day dealing with a sick horse. "Do what?" "Take care of everyone. The ranch hands, Mrs. Coleman, me. It would be easier and cheaper to just hire whoever was cheapest and not worry about the rest." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stars that were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "I suppose because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because building something good requires more than just profit. It requires people who believe in what they're building." That autumn, everything changed. Word came that a large cattle company back east was looking to buy ranches in the territory, offering prices that were hard to refuse. Several of Marcus's neighbors sold out immediately, eager to take the money and move on to easier lives in California or back east. The offer that came to Marcus was substantial, enough money to set him up comfortably for the rest of his life anywhere he chose to go. Sarah watched him consider it, saw the way he stared at the letter for long minutes without speaking. "Are you going to sell?" she asked finally. "I don't know," he admitted. "It would solve a lot of problems. The ranch barely breaks even most years, and it's not getting any easier." The thought of him leaving, of the ranch being broken up and sold off to strangers, filled Sarah with a panic she didn't entirely understand. This place had become home in a way she'd never experienced before, and the idea of losing it felt like losing herself all over again. "What about the men? What about Mrs. Coleman?" "They'd be taken care of," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The company says they'll keep on experienced hands." Sarah knew enough about large cattle companies to know that such promises were rarely kept. The men who worked the ranch would be scattered to the winds. Mrs. Coleman would be turned out with little more than her personal belongings, and the sense of community that had been built here would be destroyed as surely as if a tornado had swept through. That night, she made a decision that surprised even her. She found Marcus in his study, poring over financial records by lamplight. "I want to learn the business," she announced without preamble. He looked up, startled. "What business?" "The ranch. Cattle, horses, land management, all of it. I want to understand how it all works." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Why? Because someone needs to," she said simply. "And because I think I could be good at it." The smile that spread across his face was the first truly happy expression she'd seen from him since she'd arrived. "I think you could be too." They started the next morning, with Marcus teaching her to read the ranch's books and understand the economics of cattle ranching. She learned about seasonal cycles, about the costs of feed and veterinary care, about the delicate balance between the number of cattle the land could support and the profit margins that made the operation viable. She rode out with the hands to learn about the daily work of managing cattle, how to spot signs of disease or injury, how to judge the quality of grazing land and the condition of water sources. The men who had initially treated her with distant respect began to accept her as a legitimate part of the operation when they saw that she was willing to work as hard as anyone. Mrs. Coleman taught her the business side of running the household, how to manage supplies and seasonal workers, how to negotiate with suppliers and keep track of expenses. "A ranch is only as good as the people who run it," the older woman explained. "And people need to be fed and housed and treated fairly if you want them to do good work." Winter came early that year, with snow falling in October and temperatures dropping below freezing for weeks at a time. It was during one of these cold snaps that they got word that rustlers had been hitting ranches throughout the territory, stealing cattle and horses and selling them across the border in Mexico. Marcus doubled the guard rotations and made sure all the men were armed. But Sarah could see the worry in his face. Losing cattle to rustlers could mean the difference between profit and loss for the year, and a bad year could force him to sell to the Eastern Company whether he wanted to or not. The attack came on a moonless night in December, with snow falling heavily enough to muffle sound and reduce visibility to a few yards. Sarah was awakened by gunshots and shouting from the direction of the main corral, and she dressed quickly and grabbed the rifle Marcus had insisted she learn to use. From the window of her room, she could see muzzle flashes and moving figures, but the snow made it impossible to tell who was who. She could hear Marcus shouting orders, trying to coordinate the defense of the ranch while preventing the rustlers from making off with the horses. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. When the shooting finally stopped and the snow settled, 3 rustlers lay dead in the corral and 2 of the ranch hands were wounded, though not seriously. More importantly, they'd prevented the theft of nearly 50 head of cattle and the entire horse herd. It was while they were checking on the wounded men that Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. One of the dead rustlers was carrying papers that showed he'd been hired not by independent thieves, but by agents of the same Eastern Cattle Company that had made the offer to buy the ranch. Marcus stared at the papers by lamplight, his face grim. "They wanted to force me to sell by making the ranch unprofitable," he said quietly. "If I couldn't protect my stock, I'd have no choice but to accept their offer." The revelation filled Sarah with a cold anger she'd never experienced before. These people had tried to destroy everything Marcus had built, had put the lives of everyone on the ranch at risk, all in service of their corporate greed. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something change in his expression, a hardening of resolve that reminded her of the cavalry officer he'd once been. "I'm going to fight," he said simply. "This ranch is worth fighting for, and so are the people who depend on it." The war with the cattle company lasted through the winter and into the spring. They hired more gunmen to attack the ranch, bribing local officials to look the other way and spreading rumors about Marcus's past to try to undermine his support in the community. But they had underestimated both Marcus's determination and the loyalty he'd earned from the people around him. The ranch hands stood by him through repeated attacks. The townspeople of Clearwater refused to be intimidated by corporate threats, and Sarah found herself taking on more and more responsibility for the day-to-day operations of the ranch. She discovered that she had a natural talent for the work, an intuitive understanding of the rhythms of the land and the animals that lived on it. More than that, she found that she genuinely loved the life loved the sense of building something meaningful and lasting in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The final confrontation came in late spring, when a dozen hired gunmen rode onto the ranch property with orders to burn out Marcus and his people once and for all. But they found themselves facing not just the ranch hands, but half the men from Clearwater, farmers and storekeepers, and even the sheriff, all armed and determined to protect one of their own. The gunmen, faced with overwhelming odds and realizing that their employers had underestimated the situation, withdrew without firing a shot. Within a week, word came that the Eastern Cattle Company had abandoned their plans for expansion into Arizona territory, deciding that the resistance they'd encountered made the venture unprofitable. That summer, as Sarah worked alongside Marcus to rebuild what had been damaged during the conflict, she realized that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd rescued from her father's desperation, and he was no longer just her protector. They had become partners in the truest sense, bound together by shared hardship and common purpose. "I've been thinking," Marcus said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "about making some changes to how the ranch is organized." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that would make you a full partner instead of just someone who works here," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The land, the cattle, the house, all of it. Equal partners in everything." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Why would you do that?" Marcus turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity or charity, but respect and something deeper that made her breath catch in her throat. "Because you've earned it. Because this place is as much yours now as it is mine, and because I can't imagine trying to run it without you." The proposal was more than business, and they both knew it. Over the months of working together, fighting together, building something together, they had grown from strangers to friends to something that neither of them had quite been ready to name. "There's something you should know," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible over the evening sounds of the ranch. "My real name isn't Sarah Mae Brennan. It's Sarah Mae Henderson. Brennan was my stepfather's name. My real father died when I was small, and my mother remarried." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately why she'd felt the need to tell him. "Does it change anything?" "It means I'm not the worthless trash Thomas Brennan claimed I was when he tried to sell me. It means I come from people who built things and worked hard and tried to leave the world better than they found it." "I already knew that," Marcus said simply. "I could see it in the way you carried yourself, even that first day in the town square. Blood will tell, Sarah Mae Henderson, and yours told me everything I needed to know about who you really are." They were married that autumn, in a ceremony held on the front porch of the ranch house with Mrs. Coleman standing as matron of honor and half the population of Clearwater in attendance. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, which she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her traveling bag all these months, and Marcus wore his old cavalry dress uniform, brushed and mended for the occasion. As they spoke their vows in the golden light of the Arizona sunset, Sarah thought about the girl who had stood on that auction block more than a year ago, terrified and hopeless and certain that her life was over. That girl could never have imagined this moment, could never have believed that such happiness was possible for someone like her. But she understood now that Marcus had been right that first day when he'd told her that everyone deserved a chance at something better. The chance he'd given her hadn't just been freedom from her father's desperation. It had been the opportunity to discover who she really was when she wasn't just trying to survive. The ranch prospered under their joint leadership, growing from a marginal operation to one of the most successful in the territory. They treated their workers fairly, paid good wages, and built a reputation for honesty and quality that brought buyers from as far away as Kansas City. More importantly, they built a life together that was rich in all the ways that mattered. They faced droughts and floods, good years and bad years, the challenges of raising children in a harsh land, and the satisfaction of watching those children grow into strong, capable adults who understood the value of hard work and treating people with dignity. Sarah never forgot where she had come from, never forgot the girl who had stood on that auction block with her chin raised in defiance, even as her world crumbled around her. But she also never let that past define her future. She had learned that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are simply the darkness before a dawn we never could have imagined. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, and she and Marcus sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains they had come to love, Sarah would sometimes think about the choice Marcus had made that day in Clearwater. $200 that had bought not ownership, but freedom. Not servitude, but partnership, not an ending but a beginning. And she would whisper a prayer of gratitude for the stranger who had seen something worth saving in a desperate girl and had had the courage to bet everything on the possibility that people could change, could grow, could become more than their circumstances had ever suggested was possible. The ranch still stands today, they say, though the buildings have been rebuilt and modernized over the decades. But locals claim that on certain evenings, when the light is just right and the wind carries the scent of sage and cattle across the rolling hills, you can still see them there on the front porch, the cavalry officer who learned that some battles are worth fighting, and the girl who discovered that freedom isn't something you're given, but something you earn, one choice at a time.